Pairing live stream. Meeting is being live streamed. All right. And just share the URL. Let me just share the URL. Why is my paste not working? Here we go. Everyone have fun plans for Halloween?
Oh, well, we don't celebrate Halloween in St. Lucia because it's not an American place, but people are, it's American influence has gone across the globe. So people who are, usually we used to have like Halloween parties before COVID come, like adult Halloween parties at the clubs or everything like that. But now COVID's not there, so there's going to be no adult Halloween parties. So, but trick or treat, no, if we don't have these things. Just usually the clubs will have some nice parties to go into.
I think I remember when we were in Denmark, I think we started to see Halloween come in.
I don't remember.
It wasn't like trick or treat in Denmark either. But then again, they also started doing Thanksgiving in a weird way too. So there's a lot of expats in Denmark from the United States, which is an interesting impact there. All right, I see we are on time. So I want to thank everyone for coming today. I got to shut down my phone apparently. Thank you everyone for coming to this conversation, which we hope is a nice, timely conversation, given that it is spooky season, at least in the United States. And as Princess was just saying, increasingly around the world because of the United States, which may be something to talk about actually. But this is a dialogue to talk about horror and why horror is so popular and why it is so dominant in various cultures around the world, especially at this time of year or Southern Hemisphere, opposite time of year. But, when the season gets darker, essentially, it becomes very popular. So we wanted to just have a conversation about the popularity of horror for spooky season. And we have with us many returning guests, such as Christine, Christopher, Chris, and Princess. But we also have a new guest, Dr. Paul Bones, and we will be having another one. He's running a little late because this dialogue bumped up against when he teaches, so he'll be joining us soon. But I thought perhaps because Dr. Bones, you are our new guest and also your name is perfect, I would let you first introduce yourself and what brings you here.
Hi, I'm Dr. Bones. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at Texas Women's University in Denton, Texas. My main areas of research are sociology, criminology, and disability. In terms of what brings me here, as you pointed out, my last name is Bones. So I've always, ever since I was a wee one, had a bit of a fascination with the strange, the unusual, and things I probably shouldn't have been watching at that age.
Wait, your name is not a derivation of Chris? Can we call you Chris just to avoid confusion?
Yeah, sure. If calling me Chris removes confusion, then sure.
I was going to say, how does that remove confusion?
I don't know. It's an old Monty Python bit.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, thank you, Paul. Thank you for being here today. Looking forward to hearing more from you, especially with the angles you're bringing on sociology and criminology. Let's go down then to Princess to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Princess O'Nika Auguste. I'm from St. Lucia. I have a BA in English with minors in history and sociology, and I have MDiv in MDiv, Master's of Divinity, where I concentrate in church history and New Testament, and I have a Master's of Theological Studies, Biblical Studies, and Belief Christianity, and I have a few certificates in medieval history and medieval religion, and editing and writing. And what brings me here, I love horror. Like Dr. Bones, I was watching things that I wasn't supposed to watch at a young age, but I like a good scare. So
Well, and also your background in both medieval history and theology, there's no horror that comes out of any of that.
that's full, the religion and history is full of horror. So yeah.
Oh, yes. All right. Thank you, Princess, for being here today. And then we're going to go over, oh, I see now why you said, because we also have Christine.
Yes, and Christopher. There's three of us.
Yeah, I haven't had enough caffeine yet today, I think, or enough Halloween candy. But let's go over to Christine, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, hello. I'm Christine Tomlinson. I work at the University of California, Irvine, as well as Simon Fraser University. I'm trained in sociology, but I do most of my teaching in general social sciences, and I do a lot of my work on pop culture and in particular video games. I am a horror fan, so I definitely have some interest there. I'm Halloween ready. I came prepared with my little pumpkin shirt. But yeah, very excited to talk about kind of the social and social psychological backgrounds for why people enjoy horror today.
Yes, and that's wonderful. And also the video games experience you're bringing too. There's so many horror video games out now. And they're even remastering and putting out the older ones again. So that's a really great way of thinking about horror when it comes to popular culture. So thank you for being here, Christine. And then we're going to go down to Christopher.
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Christopher. I'm a PhD candidate at Paderborn University and in music, and my research is around like aesthetics and especially cuteness, but also the inherent zaniness of cuteness, so to speak. So
You've also researched metal music, correct?
Oh yeah, metal, right? Metal music as well,
which has a lot of horror elements combined into all of that. And also, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but sometimes I think something that's way too cute is way too scary.
Yeah, I also see the similarities to like horror movies with like cutesy, supposedly cutesy elements.
Mm-hmm. And the sound of children laughing in the wrong context, most terrifying sound in the world.
Exactly.
Oh, and I see our sixth guest is here. So Joshua, thank you for coming. I know it's your first time, I believe, in a dialogue. So we're just introducing ourselves. If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and what brings you here today.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Josh. I am a PhD candidate over at the University of Guelph in Canada, and my office lighting is terrible. But I primarily work on horror and mental health as a part of my research. So exploring different ways that mental health is not only perhaps represented, but also effectually worked through in terms of horror film. And certainly as a scholar who experiences a number of different mental phenomena, I look at, how these mental differences play out in film, and it's fascinating stuff.
Well, that's wonderful. And I want to read more of your work. And actually, that's an interesting segue then to, I think, letting Chris introduce himself, given, I think, the overlap that you might have in research there.
Well, my name is Christopher Olsen. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Currently working on my dissertation, which looks at Nicholas Winding Refn, the Danish director, as a paratext and what he and his various works can tell us about the pre and post streaming media ecologies. But I'm also, like Joshua, I have an interest in research into mental health and media. And I just had a book come out recently on normalizing mental illness and neurodiversity in entertainment media. So that's out there in the world. And my connection to horror, I've been a lifelong horror fan since I was way too young. I remember seeing Nightmare on Elm Street, and when Freddy came through the wall the first time, it just scared the crap out of me, and I've been a fan ever since. And I also have another connection to horror because Carrie and I co-authored a book on exorcism cinema and the cultural tensions that exist within that. And I'm also a big fan of cult film, and cult film tends to gravitate toward horror in a lot of ways, like comedy and horror are the two kind of big ones. So it's just been a big part of my life for a long time.
It seems that there are interesting sensibilities when it comes to comedy and horror that can get very unique and very niche. And I think that might be something to consider too. But I kind of just wanted to start this conversation with a broad question about, why is horror so popular? Why do people in various popular cultures around the world love getting scared?
I think, I think like fear is one of the emotions, one of the normal emotions of our psyche. I mean, we get angry, we love, but we also get scared. And then so even if that we get scared, some part of us like the idea of some monster or evil deity coming to scare the crap out of us. So I don't think there's really a reason per se of why we as humans love horror. I think it's just part of us. We were in the words of Lady Gaga, we were born this way or made this way.
Yeah, and just to kind of build off that, I like, there's this Laotian filmmaker that I like named Matty Doe, who directed what is considered the first Laotian horror film, Chantali. And in interviews, she's talked about how like fear is kind of the universal emotion. And for the most part, like whenever you go around the world, like fears are pretty standard. I mean, there's cultural specificity with a lot of fear, like, ghosts are kind of different in different cultures and stuff like that. But it's this kind of universal feeling for people, and it's easy to tap into. But it's also, and this is something else that Matty Doe talks about, it's also like a roller coaster ride. You're having fun while you're being terrified in some ways, because you're kind of going on this
it's kind of fun too. It is fun to be scared. I mean, I remember the first time that I watched Nightmare on Elm Street. I was a little girl, but I actually had fun. And then there's the horror comedy. There's the horror comedy with Chucky. I mean, I was scared, but I was laughing a lot of it too, because even though Chucky's supposed to be scary, he is funny. I know there's a TV series Chucky coming on Sci-Fi, so.
I think just to build off of both of those things, it's kind of cool that horror also works as a little bit of a cultural capsule, because depending on the time period you look at or the country, fear is universal, but the specific things that happen, we can see like bumps in zombie movies, for example, or suddenly slashers get really popular. And in some ways people have tried to correlate that to what's going on in society and what's going on in a culture, but it's really interesting to track those changes and what it is that does scare people and people are engaging with in that way. But it's also kind of a safe arena to feel those feelings. Life is stressful, life is scary, but you can kind of use it to work through those feelings in this sort of separate arena for fear.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I also think that one of the reasons why horror is so popular, it has a social control element to it. So if you look back, a lot of the roots of horror were in folk tales and the tales that we tell children. I don't have children myself, by understanding those, that if you tell them things like, don't go into the woods, there are bears there, you will get eaten, they will be like, ooh, bears. I love bears. They're furry. I want to pet them. So if you tell them that, don't go into the woods because there's a witch who will skin you and make a rattle out of your teeth, all of a sudden the kids will be like, oh no, I don't like witches. I want my teeth. I don't want to go into the woods. So I feel like a lot of horror, even though we look at it as sort of this outsider deviant thing, there's a really strong moral message to a lot of it. A lot of it is very much reaffirms, traditional, especially Catholic views of religion or traditional views of masculinity and femininity. So I think that in a way, it also acts as, when we watch horror, it's something that we turn our minds off to, but it's really reassuring and reaffirms a lot of those deeper beliefs that we have about society and roles and all of that.
And I guess, again, all fantastic stuff I would love to build on. On another end, the nice thing about horror too is the fact that it allows for different groups to also articulate themselves in the process too. I mean, one of the great things about horror in many ways is that it's given birth to so many different iterations of queer theory to, discuss, the making monstrous of different identities. It's given the ability for, Black Americans to speak to, a number of social issues in society, white supremacy, police violence, gentrification. It's given people who experience mental health issues a whole new range of affects and aesthetics to work with to try to help people understand, yeah, this is kind of what I experience every day. You might not totally get it, but here's like a taste of what that is. So it's given us, a lot of different techniques for people, different backgrounds to be able to articulate just something new about themselves in the process.
Yeah, I want to go back to Princess and the pleasure of displeasure, so to speak. I think it's pleasure because it's in a safe environment. If you consider like fear as an inherent human attribute, so when we go back in time, it's like a survival mechanism, and now it's all safe, so we can enjoy this displeasure. And I think that has also something to do with like you already mentioned, like the social implications we have. And I also think that horror can be something that goes beyond what we perceive in the everyday life, that there is more, I would say, but not in a metaphysical sense. Like, okay, we see monsters in these films, but it always is a kind of reflection, like Joshua said.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember, like you're all saying first, that we have fear because it's kind of biologically built into us. It's not something that only humans experience. A lot of animals experience fear, and who knows, maybe even plants do in a different way. But it then becomes interesting the extent to which we become these sense-making creatures, and we're trying to understand the unknowns of reality. And in ways, it's like we use fear then to teach each other about these unknowns and to try to then enforce morals and ways of living through our fears then. So maybe that brings up a first question, because we mentioned like how fears can be very culturally specific. Do you think, though, that in this contemporary time of the internet, of global popular culture, are we seeing, say the fears that come out of the United States based mostly on Christianity, are we seeing those fears kind of come to be dominant around the world? Are we having globalization and cultural imperialism through our horror?
I think so. Because a lot of the I'm going to bring up the vaccination thing. Around 20% of St. Lucians are vaccinated, and we are a very conservative, religious, predominantly Catholic country. Although the Catholic Church is supporting vaccination, a lot of people are not listening, but still some people are thinking that it's the mark of the beast. We're going to die in 2 years and all that stuff. And a lot of it when I hear solutions say that, it reminds me of what I hear a lot of Americans say, like a lot of evangelical US Christians say that the vaccine is the mark of the beast, or it's a chip or something like that. So in that term, yes, US, they think that the world's going to end. Yes, US religious horror is, how you call it, influencing the rest of the world. Well, at least here. Mm-hmm. Although we do have our own issues and own hang up, but a lot of the, like I'm saying, like the Mark of the Beast one, that's definitely an American thing.
I'm going to take kind of a Foucaultian approach to this, I think. and like, no. I agree with what you're saying, but I think there's also like a flow that goes through. It's not just like a unidirectional kind of thing. I think we see horror from different cultures influencing at different times. You know, I specifically think about like the early 2000s when J-horror and stuff was really popular, and you saw like you know, Ring and its series, and then it spawned the American remake, and then all of a sudden all these American horror films had like creepy girls with dark hair in front of their face and stuff. And I think we see this like this ebb and flow as these different things become popular with audiences. And I think that goes back to like a kind of a political economic thing, where it's like this thing hits really hard and makes a lot of money, and suddenly everybody's kind of copying it. And so we have not just, you know, exporting stuff from Hollywood and whatnot, but we have things like Hollywood seeing these trends and then trying to capitalize on those as well. And then other places kind of try to capitalize on them as well. Because I think about like our exorcism book and how, you know, after The Exorcist hit, there was like 120 some exorcism movies released in like the 30 years after that. And they all kind of followed the same template. And it wasn't just in the United States, but around the world. So I think there's it like shifts in where the influence is coming from. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about that, but I feel like there's like a flow of this stuff.
If anyone would like to pick up on that, Christine?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I definitely agree with that. There do seem to be these kinds of ebbs and flows of what becomes popular when, and I know it's not exactly horror, but we are seeing a lot of like popularity of things coming out of South Korea, for example. Like you have Squid Game, which is wildly popular. And so there are these moments where things translate. And I think at this point, and I could be wrong, and please tell me if I'm off base, but at this point, I think a lot of those kinds of anxieties and fears kind of circle around ideas of capitalism, which makes them easy to tap into and very popular across cultures.
Yeah, that's true, because I was just thinking about like Parasite, Squid Games, and it's essentially that income inequality tension that it seems to be big, at least when you're looking at industrialized, post-industrialized societies. It would be interesting to see if the United States or other European countries maybe try to do their own version of Squid Games and what that would be like then.
Yeah, I think that's going to be inevitable. Yeah, we've already seen, especially as Hollywood sees that, you know, South Korea is more of a market. I know we're getting a US version of Train to Busan, despite not having trains here. And I can't imagine that capitalism would not let Hollywood get away without trying to make 1,000 copies of Squid Game. So I'm really not looking forward to that, to tell you the truth. I like Squid Game. I cannot stand the American remakes of Asian horror, though.
Is the American version of Train to Busan something like Amtrak to Chicago?
Maybe, or maybe they're just going to mix it with Speed somehow. I have no idea. That'll be on a bus.
Probably. Remakes are not always great.
Very true.
But I also think about like, I just want to pick up on a thread that Dean brought in, because I think we do see that idea of income inequality popping up in horror a lot, actually. And I mean, Squid Game and Parasite both have horror elements. Like I think with Parasite, when you see that guy coming up the stairs and he scares the crap out of the kid, that's terrifying. And just the thought of what's going on in Squid Game is terrifying. But you also see, like in the States, you see movies like, I think, was it Don't Breathe? The one where the guy was blind.
Yes.
And yeah. And the reason that the kids were breaking in was because they're low income and they were trying to get money. But you can also go like back to something like People Under the Stairs, the Wes Craven film, which was very much commenting on Reagan's America at the time. Like the two villains were even patterned after Ron and Nancy Reagan. to explore this idea of like income inequality and sort of the intersectionality of how capitalism like leaves certain people behind and whatnot. I think we do see that a lot. I think we're seeing it more and more cropping up. Like I think of Only Lovers Left Alive, the Jim Jarmusch vampire film. While it's not like a strict horror movie, it has horror elements, but then you also get like a comment on the decaying of Detroit in a lot of ways. So I think we're seeing that theme and have seen that theme kind of pop up a lot in horror.
Do you also think that we see more, to go back to the terms like localization? So you have like the zombie genre started in the United States, primarily the way we think of it, of course, with Night of the Living Dead. But then we have seen it, adapted and adopted from different cultural contexts, thinking about like the South Korean series, The Kingdom, for example. Do you think that we see more and more of that? Is that one way in which we're starting to see similarities in fears spreading around the world?
Well, the only zombies I've ever seen is movies or horror is mostly American films and TV shows. I haven't experienced zombies in mostly American or European. I haven't experienced zombies from other cultures, so I'm not sure. I'm not really sure about that. Yeah.
I mean, we brought up Train to Busan and Kingdom.
Yeah.
And those are two good examples of like how the zombie has been like recontextualized in that other cultural context. I also think about things like vampire films.
Yeah.
Vampire films are very popular around the world, and you see like different versions. Like in China, you have the Shaw brothers making movies about like Chinese hopping vampires and things like that. And so I think that's a phenomenon that's kind of been happening for a long time as different film cultures arise and start exploring their own like folklore and stuff, but using these sort of like genre tropes from other places.
Here in Germany, we also don't have any zombie movies, as far as I know. But to go back to the concept of zombie, I think it's coming from African folklore, maybe, but don't quote me on that. And maybe, a lot of horror elements coming from folklore. So from popular culture from the people that wasn't seen in the Middle Ages and popping up now with popular culture.
Yeah, I know I think it was in no, it wasn't in the 80s, but I know there was a whole wave of voodoo zombie movies, which were typically made in a colonial manner from non-Haitian or non-African filmmakers, and they ended up being just as bad and as racist as one would think from that description. So yeah, that's interesting, because when we start talking about zombies in a non-American context, that's where my mind went to first, and then tried to immediately run away.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you look at like Hollywood films, I think it goes back to the 1930s, but we started seeing like in Haiti or Cuba, you would have African, individuals brought from Africa in slavery or freed at that point. But yeah, you'd see essentially voodoo, and you'd see these types of more folkloric African religious approaches. And that's where those initial ideas of zombie came from. And then Romero comes along and basically creates the zombie that any indie horror film student essentially then copies to make their own little movie.
The Living Dead.
Yeah.
To think of it, as you say about African culture, yeah, we do have in St. Lucia, we have in St. Lucia and several of the Caribbean islands, we do have something similar to the zombie per se, but not the way it's depicted on TV. We do have a zombie. We have something called in St. Lucia, have something called a zombie. A zombie is some boy who comes back from the dead, but unlike the zombie who really can be controlled, the zombie really is not cannot be controlled. The zombie has his own personality, comes, yeah.
Well, and then we think about in terms of like the localization again, the zombie genre itself kind of split after 28 Days Later, because then you went from the shambling hordes of zombies to the running, not technically zombies, but the infected, but they're still zombies, sort of. So we kind of had like these fractures coming in as to what constitutes zombies because of how other people have taken up that idea around the world.
But yeah, a lot of the depictions of African retention religions from the Caribbean and from Africa has been portrayed as racist. Even in, much as I like Chucky, even in Chucky, when he go in and killed the guy that told him how to transfer, that was racist, So we mean this black guy is helping this serial killer go inside a doll. So yeah.
And I think that brings up a good question though too, because I think if we look across the history of horror, we do see a lot of racism, misogyny, homophobia, and so on and so forth. And what do you think is an explanation for why horror has had all of that? And are we still seeing it today?
It comes from history, even from the medieval history. Look at how the Christianity, as I can speak for Christianity, I don't know about other religions, has depicted witchcraft, anything that has to do with magic as evil. I mean, the Christian, they burned people accused of witchcraft, women. And so not only in the United States, but in Europe and other places, they burn women and some men being accused of witches. So there is this idea that if you're practicing magic, it's dark. If it's not Christianity, it's bad. If you're African from West Africa and you're practicing your African indigenous religion, it's witchcraft. But yet, Christianity, if you look at some of the rituals of Christianity, somebody from the outside can say that's witchcraft too. When we light, as a Catholic, when we light candles and honor the saints, or when we come inside the house and bless the house with the sage and everything, that can be considered witchcraft. So it's a lot have to do with white European, white American interpretation of what's not white American or white European.
And I think another thing is horror offers that space to kind of work through those social problems and those social anxieties. But as a piece of popular culture, whether it's a movie or a TV show or video game or whatever else, it's not occurring in a vacuum. So it's going to suck up any kinds of stereotypes that are dominant in a culture as well. So not just dominant fears and anxieties, but also dominant misconceptions or troubling beliefs are going to be included in it.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that, I think that, too, if you look at the way that we've kind of talked about this, horror tends to repeat itself. If one idea sells, then it gets copied 1,000 times over. I think that, you look at the social context of, the late 70s when a lot of American horror started taking off in the early 80s. Everything from that time period is very racist, very sexist, very homophobic, extremely transphobic. So I think that part of it is you get that copying. Now, with many other genres, people have stepped in, minoritized populations have stepped in and been like, okay, so this is bad. I think one of the issues as well with horror is because it's been so situated in whiteness and in hegemonic masculinity, that kind of self-referential, whatever you want to call it, looking at it and saying, okay, so this is bad and we need to separate ourselves from it, just hasn't necessarily happened. And sort of attempts to do that. Like there's still a lot of people that, make horror R-rated again, or, people that want to go back to they don't want to be PC. And there's a whole community that wants to prevent the, political correctnessification, not a word, but we're going to go with it, of horror. And, when in reality, it's like, there's ways to be scary without also being damaging and harmful.
But you don't notice in a horror film, in a horror movies, people who die first are usually the black guy, the airhead blonde girl, the girl with the blonde hair and with the airhead, and the nerd. Those are the three who die first in a horror movie.
I mean, to the point where like horror eventually started commenting on that as it became more and more self-aware. Like you'd have the African-American character suddenly realizing he's the African-American character in the horror film, and start freaking out about that.
And of course, Cabin in the Woods sets up their entire premise around that.
Yep.
It is part of the other issue, maybe in terms of the stereotypes and the continuance of all this, the fact that people might like using the stereotypes as shortcuts and heuristics so that they don't have to spend a lot of time setting up characters or story. They can just get right to the gore and the scare.
Yeah. I mean, certainly with mental health issues, I mean, it's amazingly easy for shorthand to create the meme of the escaped mental ward male patient and just shove that into a box and say, here's the guy, he's crazy. Now let him proceed to chop up, various women and minorities and, occasionally frat boys. And and it's strange because, we're seeing, in a lot of ways, some interesting movement on, the mental health side of things where, there's still mental health being created as monstrosity. Maybe it doesn't take the form of the slasher murderer, but now we have, things like Lights Out, where, depression gets created as a, metaphysical monster that essentially preys upon weak, depressed people. Or DID being used in various movies, particularly Split, where, you have, again, the monsterification of the body as a result of, this particular mental condition that this individual has. I mean, now we're seeing things like the Babadook, where there's more interesting, nuanced portrayals of the monster and the monstrosity of mental health and how to live with it better. But it still seems like in a lot of cases, it's easy to just go to, for example, mental health and say like, here's a grab bag of like old reliable tropes that we can, take from.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I actually wanted to ask kind of a question about mad representation in horror, since there are just several of us that study that. Yeah, like I have a great fondness for like old bad 70s and 80s horror movies, and I cannot tell you how many just start with the only thing you ever learn about the killer is just it starts with they escaped from a mental asylum. And it does seem like maybe there is some movement on that. And like you said, there is some realization that, maybe we need to deal with these things in a more nuanced way. Sort of my question, though, is so when we're seeing mad representation or we're seeing, disability still as the cause of, murder and homicide and everything, are we actually improving on that old model of just, I don't know, just say it's someone who escaped a mental asylum and found a drill? Are we improving on that, or are we, kind of adding more details, but still engaging with so many of those stereotypes?
I even think of things like in terms of physical different ableness and differences. The recent movie Malignant and the spin it took on physical difference. Yeah, I'm shaking. That was not a good movie. But it does do the same thing there too. I'm sorry, Christine.
Yeah, I was just going to say on the idea of using stereotypes in these contexts, I think you see a lot more nuance, and it's not even necessarily always good nuance, but more nuance at least in things that are like indie films or things that aren't getting a lot of attention. For the most part, when you see stereotypes used in popular culture, it's because that's the thing that can kind of create cultural resonance, which is unfortunate, but it does give that shorthand of, oh, I see this and I recognize this and I understand this. And in some ways, it does tap into those misconceptions and fears that people have linked to mental health. And I'm really fighting the urge to talk about mental health in horror video games because it's super interesting, but it's going to get us off track. But yeah, I do agree with that.
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, that would be great.
It's so interesting the way that video games do that. But yeah, for now, the stereotype thing, yeah, I definitely agree that it is a shorthand because people can see it and recognize it immediately, and it doesn't necessarily do anyone any favors, but it can get more viewership, which is sort of the issue that we run into with a lot of these stereotypes that we see.
I don't think that's endemic to just horror. I mean, I think that's just film and TV and media in a lot of ways, because when you only have a finite amount of time to create a character or something, or to create a story, you're going to fall back on some easily recognizable things that people can relate to. And a lot of times now, I think people are doing like more stereotypes as they try to appeal to audiences around the world. They're trying to avoid like that real sort of nuanced specificity to try to get this broader audience as they try to get more eyeballs in front of it and stuff.
But I think that issue of time, though, and that limitation is interesting, because I think we could definitely see it applying to film, but I think about like television and video games and how they can have more time to develop the characters and the story and the setting. So the fact that, are we seeing then those same stereotypes coming up in things like The Walking Dead, Squid Games? I'm not a horror game person because they terrify me and I literally cannot do them. But are we seeing that even in those texts that do have more time to get to the nuances?
And I was going to add a quick note if I can, sorry. I was also going to say, while it happens in all popular culture and media, I think that horror makes it more blatantly obvious because of the death and the violence involved. Because suddenly now you're seeing this character die immediately, for example, like we were talking about a minute ago. Whereas it might be a little bit harder to catch when you don't have that elimination of characters. Sorry.
Well, I think it's also interesting because Carrie Lynn brought up, physical difference and everything like that. Like, I still feel like I don't want to turn this into me hijacking this to just talk about disability, but like, I think you'd be hard pressed to think of a horror movie that didn't revolve around disability in some way, or the fear of disability. And if you look at, you mentioned the idea of stereotypes to sort of send, a shorthand, or the idea of like, well, just preying on the audience's association of like physical difference with danger. You look at someone like Freddy Krueger, who's a child murderer with knife hands. Like, why does he also need to have a burned face? I think he invades your dreams. I think we've already established this is a scary guy. Like, you have, and it's just a thing. We see this time and time again in movies. Even with Friday the 13th, Tom Savini decided that boy Jason needed to have facial difference because that would be really scary. And I'm like, well, zombie kid from the lake jumping out seems pretty scary to me in the first place. But yeah, that's a whole nother issue. I'll stop now.
And I do wonder like how much of that goes to the abject. Sorry, Chris, but just this idea of like something being deviant from what we think, and like how much of that fuels all of that. Sorry, Chris.
No problem. That's the exact same thought that I also had. That there's like maybe a pure aesthetic component of monsters, I would say. Like when you see these abominations, they have, I don't know, they look kind of physically or realistically impossible, but they are still there and doing their creepy stuff. And maybe that's the horror element right there.
Yeah, I think there's a big aspect to that idea of body horror, because technically, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but I think technically all horror comes down to our awareness of death. And that's like the ultimate body horror, because at some point our body stops and decays. And that is the absolute abject state then at that point. So maybe everything from physical to mental differences when it comes to horror is just building on the fact that, well, at some point our flesh melts off and, worms get us and all kinds of gross stuff happens to us.
I want to jump in there to add on to Dr. Bones' comment about Freddy Krueger. Even the way he was created, what was made, is kind of like a dis or insult stereotype to disability. His mother was in a mental hospital, and I think they say that Freddy Krueger is the son of 100, meant insane, crazy man. I can't remember the exact quotes about him, but yeah, they were saying that. So it's actually showing that if you're in an insane asylum, you're crazy and you are capable of raping this woman, this nun, And then even with Friday the 13th Jason, if you go back to his background, Jason didn't really talk too much. He had a disability and he was bullied. So you're taking this innocent child, kills him, he's being bullied and discriminated against, kill him and turn him into a monster. Mm-hmm. A killer, a zombie killer.
Yeah, I think it was in Nightmare on Elm Street 5 where they showed the birth of Freddy Krueger, the son of I think it was the son of 100 maniacs is the way that they phrased it. And for some reason, though, even when he was a baby, they gave him like the physical difference in the burn marks when they were recreating that, which didn't make sense because he was not born burned. I think that the larger issue here, I definitely agree with aesthetics and stuff like that, and that, physical difference is something that we are afraid of. It's scary, and it reminds us that, we do have these meat sacks that will eventually decay. So I do totally get that. But, some of the things that I kind of wish we could move away from is I do feel like we've created this idea that evil is something that we can see. So whether it's with Freddy or with Jason or, whatever, a lot of times that physical difference is a stand-in for, the evil that's inside of them. Because we like this idea that we can tell the bad people from the good people. And well, clearly if someone is, has an eye falling out or whatever, well, they're a bad person. There's evil inside of them that's physically manifesting. And then of course the problem from that comes with, it's good for movies. It's just, I think that we as humans are also really bad at keeping movies separate from real life. So if we see someone then with physical difference or something like that, it reminds us of Freddy Krueger or of Jason Voorhees or whatever. And just somewhere in our minds, the thing clicks where it's like, oh no, bad, scary.
Mm-hmm. I was going to say, I think the Trump era showed us that, evil people do reflect the inner evil on the outside in a lot of ways.
Totally fair.
There are a lot of really terrifying and ugly people in that administration.
I do think we can get back to that idea of, that evil inside. And again, I'm not Catholic, I'm not Christian, but I do understand from the Christian theology, especially during the Middle Ages, the medieval period, there's those ideas about, you had your demons inside and those demons were then manifesting in you physically some way. And yeah, it seems like, again, we're using these horror and these folkloric ideas to help us explain reality and then teach morals. And it's just something we've done possibly since the beginning of humanity.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up, demons and stuff, because I was raised Catholic, but I'm very much lapsed. But one of the things so part of my understanding is that when Lucifer and the angels rebelled, they were paragons of beauty. And then I can't remember, because it's been a long time, if they were, made monstrous or ugly as they fell. into hell, or if that's just something that we humans have kind of created of, oh, well, beauty good, monster bad, therefore demons are clearly deformed and ugly creatures.
Yeah,
Oh,
the example. Sorry.
Oh,
Go ahead.
I'm a lapsed Catholic too. I don't think as far as I know, I don't think in any of the Catholic theology they have Lucifer, and Lucifer specifically, as turning to a monster. I think that's more of a popular culture that started in the medieval era, that these people just started making Lucifer ugly. But really, the Catholic Church doesn't really have any theology saying that Lucifer is not handsome. I mean, as a Catholic, you know that Lucifer is the father of lies, and so he can appear to you as a woman or a dog, or as we like to interpret that the snake in the garden was Lucifer. So it's not necessarily that he himself is not ugly, and that's just what we humans made him out to be. The demons, I think the demons have always been described as ugly or deformed, although demons too can appear as a woman or any animal, whatever how they want to. So I'm not sure I haven't heard any Catholic priest or any Catholic theologian say that Lucifer transformed after he fell from heaven.
Christine?
We are talking here about good and evil, and I have a very great aversion against these categories. So I think we have to get even deeper into this fear and before categorization, maybe. And I don't want to be too philosophical here, but for example, in existentialism, you have the absurd as a baseline, and then we make meanings around. So we create meanings and we categorize. And I think that's where the horror comes in, that we realize that the world is not categorized and that it is absurd, and there's no good and evil, and there's no right and wrong. And maybe that's where we can start to build up horror and interpret it in that way.
Good old existential dread.
See, that's a story I would love to see way more than another burned guy with knives that kills children.
Yeah.
I think in Alice in Borderland, there's this one scene. They play also games. I don't know if you have seen it, but it's also on Netflix from Japan. And there's this one game where they play wolf and sheep, and the protagonist has a very, I think, a very big existential crisis because he has to kill his friends. So no, I've spoiled it. So, but how this all turns out is very interesting, how it develops, because I think this game has the biggest part in the whole series. So it's not that long, but it's very interesting if you haven't seen it. Just a little advertisement.
And that was kind of going to be like the last question I wanted to ask to wrap up on is, are there any horror texts out there today, whether game, film, TV show, or whatever, that you think are going to have a bigger impact on popular culture moving forward? Things that maybe are speaking to something that we're experiencing, but have more of the ability to last over time, or maybe impact on a wider scale around the world. Because I know, I'll just start talking as you're all thinking, but because I know people are pointing to like Squid Games right now, but I don't, it's going to be interesting to see exactly how that does translate across time. I think right now everyone is interested in it more because of insights into South Korean culture, which ties into K-pop fandom, and maybe the shock aspect of it as well. I'm not sure 5-10 years from now it's going to be as impactful as something like Freddy Krueger or Jason or things like that. And maybe because it doesn't have that archetypal type character that the fandom can build itself around.
Yeah, and I think we talked about this before in I think the sort of online fandom and pop culture discussion. But I think the fact that pop culture is so segmented now that things become this flash in the pan popular thing where it's like, yeah, it's tapping into something right now, but then it just kind of disappears and it gets replaced by something else. It's so hard to predict what could have that lasting power. And it seems like even things that we think are these huge cultural touchstones kind of just fizzle out.
Yeah, I was thinking something along those same lines. It's just like the fragmentation and the sort of, this, for lack of a better term, nichification of popular culture has made it so hard for things to catch the way they did. Like we talked about Malignant before, and I think everybody who's seen it in this group really considers it a bad movie. But there are segments online of people who think it's one of the best horror movies ever made. I saw an AV Club article where they described the villain as iconic already, and I'm just like, can we give it some time before we do this? But we're seeing this, like these little pockets where things catch on. And I think it's rare when something hits really big. I mean, I think like Dune recently is hitting kind of big because it's popular with critics, it's popular with audiences, and I think it's popular with a big segment of like film Twitter and stuff, which is a mark of its sort of wide-ranging appeal. And I think it's hard to say that something is going to do that. I mean, like you said, Squid Game is really popular right now, but is it going to be popular a year from now? And that's I think part of the streaming thing too. With just this ever never-ending stream of content. I think like a couple of years ago there was that thing on Netflix called Maniac. I think it had Jonah Hill and Emma Stone, and that generated a lot of buzz for like 2 weeks, and now you don't even know what it is. And I think there's probably a lot of people who are in the same boat. So I don't know that we can predict what's going to have that sort of lasting power. I mean, I'll be interested to see if Malignant, and that's what I'm just going to refer to the character as. I don't know, I can't remember the character's name, but if Malignant becomes like a pop culture icon and if people are like dressing as Malignant for Halloween and stuff.
I think that's going to be a telling point if it's going to be long lasting, because we know, like, I don't think the Babadook would have had a long lasting impact if we didn't suddenly have the queer community latch onto the character. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see if people start cosplaying as Malignant or yeah,
whatever the character's name was.
Yeah.
I think fandom is very fickle these days. So I'm agreeing with everybody, fickle these days. And they probably need a character to like Freddy or Jason or Chucky to rally behind. And, so, I mean, look, Chucky has a TV series, so 30 years. So, yeah, we are very fickle. I thought, like, I don't know if anybody has seen The Grudge, but I can't remember exactly what was the story. I thought at the time when I saw it, it was going to be huge. But then, I mean, it wasn't. So, yeah, we are very fickle. Unless we get a Chucky or a Jason or Freddy Krueger.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. We need a character that can be commodified, and I'm just not really seeing much of that right now. I think there's also, I missed the fandom discussion, but I think there is also a tendency of like something will get popular really quickly, and then for whatever reason, whether it's Twitter culture or just culture in general, we'll come in and tear it down, talk about how bad it actually was and how derivative it was and how damaging it was. And so it seems like whenever there is a tendency to rally around some kind of a horror symbol. Mean-spirited people like me will point out how terrible it was, like Malignant, which was terrible. It doesn't even make sense. How can someone pop out of the back of your skull? It doesn't make sense.
Yes, it doesn't. I dislike that movie so much. It doesn't. It's horrible.
But again, it's a character that has a specific physical difference that apparently gives them superpowers, and it produces then something along the lines of Freddy Krueger and Jason and Michael Myers and Chucky and so on and so forth.
But then I also have to wonder how much of the supposed latching onto of the Malignant, how much of that is just nostalgia for a Freddy or a Jason or a Michael Myers?
Well, and I also think too, like, because I've just like been racking my brain for stuff, but I think like because James Wan is he's very popular right now in terms of like horror, and I feel like maybe Annabelle could have popular. That. What?
I said Annabelle is popular.
I was going to say that character could possibly have that longevity, and the whole Conjuring universe, because they've made like, very popular characters of the Warrens through the portrayals in those films, and I feel like that series, and maybe even like Saw, like Jigsaw, might have that sort of lasting power, because we've seen how many Saw movies now. And they're all garbage, but they just keep going and going. They're
not all garbage.
They're terrible, but they just keep
going.
Them. And
I loved it. Almost all the movie except the last one.
I was never a fan.
I'm not a James Bond fan.
Jigsaw has that sort of pop cultural ubiquity in a lot of ways. So these are characters that might stand the test of time, but I don't know for sure. Well,
I think we're at our hour mark, so it's a good time to wrap up. I want to thank you all for coming and talking about this. It's making me want to look at this event that's happening apparently here in the in the Chicagoland, that I swear it's a Korean community saying that, hey, if you like the Squid Games, come and learn more about Korean culture. And I'm like, I really hope you guys aren't playing Squid Games, because that would be really bad. But yeah, trying to think about, what is going to last, what could last. Do we have just too much fragmentation? Do we not have the direct to movie market of the 1980s that helped a lot of horror as well? So it's a really interesting topic, and I think we could go off on this in a lot of different directions. So thank you all for coming here today and sharing your thoughts.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Sorry, I dominated discussion.
Thank you.
That's all good. I love hearing all these ideas. Thank you. Have a good one, everyone.